one of the things you picked up, and is the subject of your book Extreme Environment, is the need by green groups to somehow turn up the emotive and exaggerated rhetoric in order to make an impact, which in a way kind of destroys all possibility of having a sort of debate about anything, really.
Well, you know, it's a strange thing. It has two effects. One, when anyone is inclined to look critically at what they claim, they suffer from the cry wolf effect.
Yes.
Right? Occasionally they do raise something that you need to look at, that is an
Yes.
issue, that is a concern.
Yeah.
But I, for one, am not inclined to believe them, because I've seen every time I do look into one of the
Yes.
issues that they raise alarm about,
Yes.
it turns out to be wildly exaggerated or outright false.
But are you
So
any
it
more?
undermines their own cause.
Are you any more inclined to believe the oil industry?
Oh, no.
Yes.
Oh no, I don't
Yes.
believe them at all.
Yes.
No, I think they have shown themselves to be self-interested liars on many occasions.
Yes.
I don't trust them
Any more?
any more than I trust the environmental industry.
Yes. So why do you think why do you think the green groups do this? Because it doesn't help their cause in the long run.
I don't think. Well, frankly, I think it does help their cause in the long run.
Okay.
You know, I'm skeptical, yes, and a lot of people are skeptical of them, but the general public, right, who all they hear is 2-butoxyethanol in the drinking water.
Yes.
Well, okay, you're going to be against that.
You can't be in
right?
favour of that one.
No,
Yes.
no.
Yeah.
Right? You won't know that this is actually a common ingredient in hand soap, and is more likely to come from your sewage
Yes.
than from hydraulic fracturing.
Yes.
Right? They are going to lobby the government to ban fracking in their areas,
Yes.
right? On fears that have been whipped up by the environmental groups very successfully,
Yes.
right? And which really can't be judged by lay people. You know,
Yeah.
I spent 2 years studying the subject.
Yes.
You know, so I've got a far more critical and in-depth view on
Yeah.
it.
And are there other topics other than fracking where you think that they've done the same disservice to the facts?
Ironically, when I started writing my book, I thought, okay, well, let me look at some other issues, and then I thought, okay, let me not pick the easy ones.
Yes.
Let me pick the difficult ones.
Yeah.
And I started looking at Deepwater Horizon.
Yes.
Right? Could they exaggerate about what was obviously a very severe disaster?
Yes.
And oh yes, they could.
Yes.
They told us that the entire Gulf would be dead.
Yes.
They told us that oil would wash up in the Arctic.
Yes.
Right? Never happened.
Yes.
Right? The Arctic is the Gulf is back to close to where it was before the accident in 2010.
Yes.
The only difference is that a number of fishermen killed themselves because they were told by the environmentalists
Yes.
that they would never
Work again.
work again.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, they managed to severely exaggerate the effects even of a very severe incident.
Yes.
I then looked at the worst oil spill ever, which was during the Gulf War, the Persian
Yes.
Gulf. I thought, well, surely the Persian Gulf must be pretty much dead
Yes.
after all of that, because nobody went in after that war and did any cleanup.
Yes.
Right. It turns out they did send a research ship in there about a year later, which was astonished, right, that there was on some of the sheltered beaches there was still some oil, and there was
Yeah.
some tar balls in some of the deep gullies and so on, but the grasses where the dugongs breed and all of that were perfectly fine. The
Yeah.
turtles were perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Everything seemed to be recovering perfectly fine. Just a year
After it had happened.
After it had happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so the notion that the environment is this fragile thing that, you know, we're busy destroying it, or that
Yes.
we can destroy the Karoo by drilling for gas over there.
Yes.
No, we may have a small impact.
Yes.
There is some small risk,
Yeah.
but it is a manageable risk. And in the
But
context
you've used
of the
a
benefits,
term. You've used a term which I think is hard to use in the current discussions, which is manageable risk.
yeah,
And people like to think that life can go on without risk.
without risk. Well, that's nonsensical, isn't it?
Yes.
You know,
But that is the implication quite often.
If I wanted no risk, I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning.
Sure.
Although my doctor tells me even that constitutes some risk to me.
Right.
You know, everything involves some level of risk. Right?
Yes.
The question is whether the risk is justifiable, whether the risk is manageable.
Yeah.
You know, whether we can, you know, if something does go wrong, can we institute remedial action?
Yes.
You know, which in the case of pollution, you certainly can.
Yes.
In fact, one of the interesting things is when I read course material from the International School of Well Drilling,
Yes.
right, because I had to know how these wells get drilled.
Yes.
One of the reasons why they drill wells is for remediation of water aquifers.
Yeah.
Right? So when pollution does happen, and the water, the drinking water, the water aquifer does get polluted.
Yes.
They drill a hole, suck the water out,
Yeah.
put it through a cleaning plant process, and pump it back in.
Yeah.
Right. Remediation is possible. It might be expensive.
Yes.
Right. But it's possible. And once we know that it's possible, we know the cost of remediation, we know the chances of it happening.
Yes.
We can work out and say, okay, are we prepared to take this risk?
Yeah.
And in the case of gas drilling, I think it's absolutely worth taking the risk.
In terms of the media, through who we understand these issues in the most part, the ability to understand and deal with them is very difficult because they tend to kind of light on something and move on.
Yeah.
You give the particular example of the Gerrit van Tonder paper. Explain what happened there.
Well, it was interesting actually because Van Tonder had been in favour of fracking, and he then built a model which is partially based on what he knows about the very deep water underneath the Karoo, and said, well, if he assumes that the water moves upwards, which it may do, and there are preferential pathways by which it would move upwards, such as faulty wells or dolerite intrusions, which are common in the Karoo, then it would reach the surface in 30 or 40 or 50 years. Right? He's got a little pretty picture on a computer screen that shows this happening. But of course this is all based on an assumption.
Yes.
Right? There is
down in the small print.
There is no actual evidence
Yes.
right, that this deep water actually does come up
Yes.
through preferential pathways that incidentally already exists in the Karoo.
Yes.
Right. The one thing that he doesn't answer, for example, is if there's all this deep salt water, which is very salty,
Yes.
more salt than the sea, in fact,
Yeah.
if it does go up via these dolerite intrusions, and farmers drill their wells at these dolerite intrusions because that's where they find fresh water,
Yeah.
why do they find fresh water and not salty water?
Yes.
Right. There seems to be some inconsistency here that at least warrants further research.
Yes.
Right.
And how does he respond?
Well, he agrees that there is further research,
Yes.
but he's opposed to the very process by which this further research would take place,
Yes.
which is permitting exploration.
Yes.
Right? Remember that permitting exploration is a very different process from permitting exploitation of
Yes.
the resource,
Yes.
actual production.
Yeah.
Right. Exploration is a 9-year process, the first 2 years of which is basically spent on environmental impact assessments.
Yes.
They're going to drill some holes, they're going to do seismic tests, they're going to figure out exactly where all the water is, where
Yeah.
all the dolerite intrusions are, what all that impact is going to be.
Yeah.
If he wants to have this research done,
Yes.
right, which I think is a reasonable demand,
Yeah.
right, then he should be in favour of permitting exploration.
Yes.
But then what happened is he went to the media. Right?
Yeah.
He had not yet written a paper. In fact, I asked him for a paper. I was the only journalist on the planet who actually asked him for a copy of his paper. It hadn't been published. It hadn't been peer-reviewed.
Yeah.
He sent it to me about 5 days later in a very unfinished state.
Yes.
But in the meantime, he'd given interviews to the media.
Yes. As if it had been written.
As if it was all a conclusive thing, and fracking prof makes U-turn.
Yes.
Bang, and those were the headlines.
Yes.
And a few days later, once I'd actually gone and read the paper and
Yeah.
wrote some criticisms of the paper, and some of his other scientists
Yeah.
came to me and said, look, they really don't understand how this guy can make these claims. By then the issue had died out.
Yes.
So what does the public know?
Yeah.
U-turn professor. That's all they know about. They don't know that these issues are in fact being debated, that there's significant question about the validity of his claims.
Yes.
And they're not following the debate. And the same problem occurs with policymakers. Right? You think of a government regulator.
Yes.
What do they do all day? Well, they don't sit and study fracking all day.
No.
Right? They don't have the time for that. Right? They bring in a few experts and they read the headlines.
Yes.
And have to make public policy decisions based on that.
Yes.
And that's where, to go back to the environmental exaggeration, that's where it really does damage. Right?
Yes, because it creates a mood music.
Because now politicians do what they think the public wants,
Yes.
or even what they think might be the right thing to do,
Yes.
based on what someone like Jonathan Deal or the Treasure of the Crew Action Group says.
Yes.
Right? Writes laws accordingly, right? Which either raises the prices for commodities that you and I have to buy,
Yes.
right, or bans them altogether.
Yes.
Right? And that, frankly, is not something that I think a developing country with 25% unemployment and high poverty levels can afford.
Ivo, thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you, Russell.